Follow the story until the very end. And when you're done, drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to know where you are. I was standing in my son's backyard, holding a plate of food I hadn't touched, when my daughter-in-law looked at me across the picnic table and said, "You need to stop inserting yourself into our family decisions." Just like that, in front of the kids, in front of the neighbor she'd invited from 2 streets over who didn't know me from a stranger. My grandson Benji had just turned 7. There were streamers on the fence and a half-eaten cake shaped like a dinosaur on the table. And I stood there holding that plate of coleslaw thinking, I drove 4 hours for this. I didn't say a word. I set the plate down, excused myself to use the restroom, and sat on the edge of the bathtub in my son's house for about 5 minutes, just breathing. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what she said, though that was bad enough, but because I realized I had been telling myself a story that wasn't true. I had been telling myself that if I was patient enough, kind enough, helpful enough, things would get better, that she would come around, that my son would find a way to smooth things over. He hadn't, and she hadn't, and I needed to stop waiting. My name doesn't matter as much as what I'm about to tell you. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I raised 2 children, mostly on my own after my husband passed. I worked as a bookkeeper for 31 years, and I have 3 grandchildren. I love more than I have words for. What also matters is that before that birthday party, I had already quietly done something that my daughter-in-law didn't know about. Something that, when she found out, made her call me 7 times in one afternoon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. My son. I'll call him my son throughout this because that's who he is to me, whatever else has happened. Married his wife 8 years ago. I remember the wedding. It was beautiful. She wore her hair pinned up with small white flowers, and when she walked down the aisle, I cried. I genuinely liked her then. She was funny and sharp, and she seemed to make him happy in a way I hadn't seen before. The first 2 years were fine. Normal. We had our adjustments. She had strong opinions about holidays, about how often we visited, about what kind of parenting advice was welcome. I respected that. I bit my tongue more times than I can count because I'd been a mother-in-law myself for 2 years before my son's marriage, and I understood that these women come into a family and have to find their footing. I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who made that harder. But then Benji was born, and then, 2 years later, his little sister. And somewhere in that stretch of time, things shifted in a way I still don't fully understand. It wasn't one event. It was more like water damage, slow, invisible, and by the time you notice it, the structure is already compromised. She started making comments, small ones at first, about how I held the baby, about how I gave the kid sugar, about how I gave the kid sugar, about how I hovered. I absorbed them. I adjusted. I asked her directly once, very gently, over coffee when my son was at work, whether I'd done something to upset her. She said no. She smiled and said everything was fine. Everything was not fine. By the time Benji was 4, I was getting maybe 6 weeks of access a year. Not formally. Nothing was ever stated outright, but invitations stopped coming. When I called, my son would answer and sound tired and say they'd been busy. I started driving the 4 hours to visit without being invited, and then I started getting the impression I should have called first. So I started calling first, and then somehow that turned into me needing to give 2 weeks' notice. 2 weeks' notice. To see my own grandchildren. I never raised my voice. I never interfered. And I want to be careful with that word, because she used it so often it started to feel like a weapon. Every time I offered to help with childcare so she could rest, that was interfering. Every time I asked about the kids' school, that was interfering. Every time I sent birthday money directly to the children, rather than to their parents, that was interfering. The birthday money thing became a whole incident. My daughter-in-law found out I had opened savings accounts for both grandchildren at my local credit union. Small ones, nothing dramatic, just a place I'd been putting $50 here and there since they were born. She called my son at work. He called me that evening sounding genuinely upset, which was rare, and told me she felt I was going around them and that anything financial having to do with the kids needed to go through them first. I apologized. I didn't close the accounts. Looking back now, I think that was the beginning of her understanding that there were limits to how far she could push me. I was quiet, I was accommodating, but I was not a pushover. And I think that bothered her more than if I'd just been difficult from the start. The year before the birthday party, things deteriorated significantly. My son got a promotion and they moved to a nicer neighborhood. New house, more space, better school district. I was happy for them. I sent a houseplant and a card. I was not invited to see the new house for 4 months. When I finally visited, I noticed things. The guest room, which had always been informally understood to be my room when I visited, had been converted into a home office. There was no place for me to stay overnight anymore. I would need to get a hotel, a 20-minute drive away. I didn't say anything. I got the hotel. That Christmas, I bought both grandchildren what I believed were thoughtful gifts. Benji loved dinosaurs. His sister was just starting to read. I got him a box of fossil replicas from a museum gift shop and her a beautiful illustrated set of early chapter books. My daughter-in-law emailed me 3 days later, not called, emailed, to let me know that they were trying to be intentional about limiting plastic toys and screen-free books only from certain publishers, and asked that in the future I check with her before buying anything. I sat with that email for 2 days before I responded. I thanked her for letting me know. Then I made an appointment with an attorney. Not because of the email. The email was just the last straw in a long pile of straws. I made the appointment because I had been thinking about this for a while, quietly, carefully, the way I think about most things. I had money set aside. Not a fortune, but meaningful. My husband had left a small life insurance policy when he passed, and over the years I'd been careful with it. I had always intended for that money to eventually benefit my grandchildren. I had just assumed it would happen naturally, informally, through the course of a normal family life. I was no longer confident that normal family life was available to me. The attorney I saw was a woman about my age, very calm, very practical. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What kind of help are you looking for?" I said I wanted to make sure my grandchildren were protected, that whatever happened between me and their parents, the money I intended for those children actually reached those children. She nodded. She said there were ways to do that. She explained what a trust was. Not the complicated kind you read about in estate law textbooks, but a straightforward vehicle where I could name myself as trustee, designate the children as beneficiaries, specify the age at which they could access it, and make clear that neither parent could touch or redirect those funds. I asked her how long it would take. She said a few weeks. I said, "Let's begin." I did not tell my son. I did not tell anyone. I went home and I continued my life as it was. Sending cards, calling on birthdays, driving 4 hours when I was permitted, staying at the Holiday Inn 20 minutes away. I helped where I was allowed to help. I smiled at family dinners when she made offhand comments about how I'd always had a lot of opinions. I watched my grandchildren grow from a careful distance and I held it together. The trust was finalized on a Thursday in March. I have the paperwork in a folder in my desk drawer. I remember the day I signed it very clearly. I went home after the attorney's office and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat at my kitchen table and I felt something I can only describe as settled. Not happy exactly, just steady, like I had done the one thing in my power to do and now it was done. 2 months later was Benji's birthday party. And that was where his mother looked me in the eye and told me to stop inserting myself into their family decisions. I drove home that evening instead of staying at the hotel like I'd planned. 4 hours, most of it in silence. I thought about what she'd said, and I thought about my grandchildren's faces, and I thought about Benji asking me right before I left whether I was coming back for his school play in November. I said I hope so. He looked at me in that way children have of knowing more than you want them to. The week after the party, my son called. He said my daughter-in-law had been upset since the birthday, and that she wanted me to understand that they needed space to parent without outside pressure. He sounded like he was reading from notes. I asked him whether those were his words or hers. There was a long pause. He said it was something they'd talked about together. I told him I loved him. I told him I loved his children. I told him I wasn't going to argue. Then I said, I want you to know that I've taken steps to make sure the kids are taken care of regardless of what happens between me and their mother. You should know that. He said, What does that mean? I said, It means I love your children. Get some sleep. I can only imagine the conversation that happened after he hung up with me. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. It was my daughter-in-law calling from her work phone. Her voice was different than I'd ever heard it, clipped, controlled, like someone trying very hard to sound calm. She told me she'd gone to the credit union where the savings accounts were held. She had Benji's social security number and his birth certificate. She had gone in person and tried to transfer the account balances to a joint account under her and my son's name. She had been turned away because the accounts were now held under the trust and she was not a trustee. I let her talk. She went through several versions of the same complaint, that this was her children's money, that she had a right to know what was happening with it, that I had gone behind their backs, that this was exactly the kind of behavior she had been trying to address. When she was finished, I said, The money is safe. The children will have access to it when they're 25. Neither you nor my son can redirect it. That was my intention when I set it up. And I want to be clear that the intention was always to protect the children. She said, That's not your decision to make. I said, Actually, it is. It's my money. It was always my money. I chose to put it in trust for your children because I love them. The how and when of that is entirely up to me. She hung up. She called back 11 minutes later, then twice more that afternoon. I didn't answer. That evening, my son called. He sounded different from the week before. Less scripted, more genuinely troubled. He asked me why I hadn't told him about the trust. I told him the honest truth because I wasn't confident the information would stay where I put it. There was a long silence. He said, Mom, that's not fair. I said, I know, and I'm sorry for that part, but I need you to hear me when I say that I have watched myself be slowly pushed out of my grandchildren's lives for 4 years, and I have been patient, and I have been quiet, and I have adjusted every behavior that was ever pointed out to me. And none of it changed anything. So I did the one thing I could do to make sure those children know that their grandmother loved them, regardless of what any adult decided. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, She's really upset. I said, I know. He said, I don't know how to fix this. I said, I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to think about what the last 4 years have actually looked like. Not what you've been told they look like. What they actually looked like. That was a harder conversation than I am making it sound. There were tears, mine eventually. There were things said that I had been carrying for years and finally said out loud, and hearing them out loud was different from carrying them. He wasn't cruel. He was, I think, genuinely surprised by some of it. Whether he had been protecting himself from knowing or whether he truly hadn't seen it, I can't say. Probably some of both. He called me back 2 days later without her knowing. I could tell because he was whispering. He said, I'm going to be honest with you. I've known things weren't right for a long time. I didn't know how bad it looked from your side. I asked him about the kids, whether they asked about me. He said yes. He said Benji still talked about the trip we'd taken to the nature center 2 summers ago. He said his daughter had the stuffed rabbit I gave her at birth and slept with it every night. I cried in a way I hadn't cried in years. That was 4 months ago now. I am not going to tell you things are perfect, because they're not. My son and his wife are in couples counseling, which he told me about, but asked me to keep private. So I'm keeping it general. I am not reconciled with my daughter-in-law. We have not had a conversation since she hung up on me that afternoon. There may come a time when we do, or there may not. What I can tell you is that last month, my son brought both children to my house for a long weekend. Just the 3 of them. No advance notice, no conditions, no hotel. Benji ran through my front door and went immediately to the kitchen cabinet, where I keep the animal crackers, and said, Grammy, are these still here? His sister stood in the doorway and looked at me with those serious eyes she's always had and said, Grandma, I brought my rabbit. I said, Bring it in, sweetheart. This is your house, too. I don't know how the rest of this unfolds. I don't know what my daughter-in-law is thinking or planning, or whether anything has genuinely changed in how she sees me. I know my son is trying. I know my grandchildren know where to find me. And I know that whatever comes next, there is money sitting in a trust at my credit union with their names on it, and no one can touch it but them. That's the part I want you to hold on to. Not the conflict, not the hurt. The part where I stopped waiting to be given something and quietly made sure the children I love would be taken care of. If you're going through something like this, if you have found yourself adjusting and apologizing and shrinking yourself down to fit into a space that keeps getting smaller, I want you to know something. You are not powerless. You may not be able to control what someone else decides. You cannot make a person respect you, but you can be steady. You can be strategic. You can do the quiet, permanent thing. And sometimes the quiet, permanent thing is enough to shift everything. Tell me the city you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one. And if the story meant something to you, share it with someone you think needs to hear it today. I've had a lot of time to sit with everything that happened, and the thing I keep coming back to, not the anger, not the hurt, but the actual lesson underneath all of it, is that the way we treat people quietly, over time, tells the complete truth about who we are. There's no hiding it forever. It always surfaces. My daughter-in-law spent years making small, careful moves. Nothing dramatic enough to point to. Nothing that would look bad in the retelling. But the accumulation of it, the 2 weeks' notice to see my own grandchildren, the hotel 20 minutes away, the email about the books, all of that added up to a picture. And eventually my son saw the picture. Not because I showed it to him, because it became impossible to look away from. That's the thing about actions over time. They compound. The ones that are unkind compound into a pattern. The ones that are steady and loving compound into something else. Into Benji knowing which cabinet the animal crackers are in. Into his sister carrying that stuffed rabbit to my house after months apart. Those small, consistent acts of love don't disappear just because someone tries to block them. They find their way through. I didn't handle everything perfectly. There were moments I was too quiet when I should have spoken up. And moments I carried hurt I should have laid down sooner. I don't think there's a clean way to navigate this kind of family fracture. But what I do believe, what this whole experience taught me in a way nothing else quite has, is that the most powerful thing I did wasn't confronting anyone. It wasn't fighting back. It was making a decision in private, from a place of clarity, and holding it steady. Intelligence, to me, doesn't mean being the loudest or the most strategic. It means understanding what's actually in your control and not wasting yourself on what isn't. I couldn't control how my daughter-in-law felt about me. I couldn't make my son see things faster than he was ready to see them. But I could protect those children. I could make sure that whatever happened at the adult level, they would have something real and lasting from me. That was a decision I made with a clear head and a full heart, and I've never second-guessed it. And the character piece. I think about this a lot. The way I was raised, you don't respond to unkindness by becoming unkind. You don't lower yourself. You stay who you are, even when it costs you. That's harder than it sounds. There were nights I wanted to say everything I was thinking. There were dinners where I sat across from her and smiled and felt the effort of it in my jaw. Staying decent when someone is not being decent to you is one of the hardest and most important things a person can do. What I hope, if you take anything from what I shared today, is this: don't shrink yourself down hoping someone will appreciate it. Be steady, be thoughtful, protect what matters, and trust that children, your grandchildren, your kids, they feel the truth of who you are even when the adults around them are trying to tell a different story. Benji knew where the animal crackers were. His sister brought her rabbit. That's enough. That's everything.